He had humiliated her that morning. He stepped on the newly cleaned floor without even looking at her. But that afternoon, he followed her, and he saw her enter an abandoned mansion, with 2 children holding hands. Inside, there was not only poverty, there were plans, calculations, technical drawings that only a brilliant mind could do. The woman who cleaned his floors was rebuilding a house, and maybe also her life. Sometimes the most valuable people are those we never see. Like this if it touched your soul. It is more than a click. It is a silent hug between those of us who know what it is to get up after falling. Comment how you think this story will end. And if you have not subscribed yet, it costs you nothing, but for us it means a lot. Thank you for being here. The lobby of the commercial building on Broadway smelled of lemon and wax. Sarah Miller had finished polishing the marble tiles only 10 minutes ago when she heard the fast steps at the entrance. She did not look up at first. She simply stepped back, squeezing the wet cloth between her hands, leaving space. James Anderson entered like a spring storm, abrupt, loud, without warning. He talked on the phone with a sharp voice, gesturing with his free hand. He wore a dark coat splashed with rain and Italian shoes that left mud marks on the newly cleaned floor. "What do you mean you cannot solve the problem? I hired you because you were supposedly the best," he shouted into the phone without stopping. "You're costing me millions, do you understand? Millions." Sarah took a step back with her back against the wall. She was 42 years old, her brown hair tied in a simple braid, and a blue uniform that was a bit big for her. In her face there was no trace of resentment, only stillness. "Sorry, sir, James passed by her without looking at her, leaving more dark marks on the tiles. "Then clean it again," he said, like someone pushing away a fly. "That is what I pay you for." He did not wait for an answer. He went up to the elevators with the phone still to his ear, without turning. Sarah remained still for a few seconds, watching the trail of mud that stretched like a wound over the white marble. Then she knelt again, wet the cloth, and started from the beginning. It was not the first time, it would not be the last. Sarah had been working in that building for 3 years, 3 years of split schedules, of scratched knees, of hands cracked by chemicals. 3 years in which no one, absolutely no one, had asked her full last name. For the executives on the 3rd floor, she was the cleaning girl. For those on the 7th, simply Sarah. For James Anderson, owner of Anderson Construction on the 15th floor, not even that. She was an anonymous presence who had to keep the spaces clean and disappear. But Sarah Miller kept a secret that weighed more than all the buckets of water she carried every day. She had been a civil engineer. She graduated with honors from the University of Boston. For 7 years she worked on infrastructure projects that still connected cities, that still held bridges over large rivers. Projects that carried her technical signature, although her name had been forgotten. Everything changed when her husband's construction company, Frank, collapsed under the weight of an economic crisis that ate the country like a silent fire. The debts not only took the company, they took the house, the savings, the professional references. Frank fell into a deep depression that kept him locked up for months, until finally he left for Maine, to his sister's house, promising to return when things got better. That was 4 years ago. Sarah had not heard from him again. With 2 children to feed, Matthew 14 and Lucy 11, Sarah knocked on every door she knew. She sent resumes to 37 engineering firms. She received 3 answers, 2 polite rejections, and a silence that hurt more than words. "You have been out of the market for 4 years, they told her in an interview. "You have lost contact with new technologies," they explained in another. What they did not say, but she understood perfectly, was, she is a 42-year-old woman with 2 children and no support. She is a risk. So she accepted the first job they offered her, and then the second, and finally this one, cleaning the same type of buildings she used to help design. That afternoon, after James Anderson went up in the elevator leaving his trail of mud and contempt, Sarah cleaned the floor with slow and precise movements. There was no anger in her gestures. There was something deeper, a silent dignity that no one could stain, not even the mud of expensive shoes. She finished her shift at 8 at night. She changed her uniform in the small locker room in the basement, put on a grey coat she had bought at a street market, and went out into the rain that kept falling over New York with biblical persistence. On the subway, pressed between exhausted workers and students with headphones, Sarah took out a worn spiral notebook. In its pages there were structural calculations, load diagrams, notes on material strength. They were the only traces of what she had been. She studied them every night like someone who prays, keeping alive a part of herself that the world had declared dead. Matthew and Lucy were waiting for her in the small apartment in Queens they shared with another family. They had eaten dinner already, sandwiches the neighbor prepared for them, and were doing homework at the shared dining table. "How was the day, Mom?" asked Lucy, looking up from her math book. Sarah smiled. It was a tired but real smile. "It was good, honey. And yours?" She did not tell them about the man who had treated her like dust in her own building. She did not tell them about the mud on the tiles. She did not tell them that while cleaning, she had noticed a crack in the wall of the lobby, a crack that suggested a structural problem in the foundation, and that her engineer mind had automatically calculated the origin and the solution of the problem. Some secrets were not to protect herself. They were to protect them. 3 weeks after the mud incident, Sarah received news that would change everything, though not in the way she expected. Her grandmother Catherine had passed away in Boston. She was 93 years old and left in peace, as her cousin told her by phone. The news arrived on a Tuesday morning while Sarah was scrubbing the bathrooms on the 5th floor. She stopped in the middle of the hallway, with the phone still in her hand, and felt something break inside her chest. Grandmother Catherine had been her refuge during childhood, the one who taught her that women could build things, not just take care of them. She had been a seamstress, but with the soul of an architect. Every stitch was a calculation, every pattern a structure thought out to the last detail. The funeral was short. Sarah travelled alone on a night bus, returned the next day without sleeping, with swollen eyes and a letter from the notary in her bag. Grandmother Catherine had left her house. It was not just any house. It was a 19th-century mansion in the Brooklyn area, in the heart of New York, a relic of times when that area was wealthy, before neglect and forgetting turned it into a shadow of itself. Sarah went to see it on a Saturday afternoon, taking Matthew and Lucy by the hand. The rain had given way to a pale sun that made the puddles in the cobblestone streets shine. The mansion was on Aurora Street, hidden between more modern buildings like a jewel buried in mud. The facade was grey stone, with wrought-iron balconies rusted by time. The windows were covered with wooden boards, and in the portal, wild grass grew between the cracks of the pavement. "Did Grandma Catherine live here?" asked Matthew, with a mix of wonder and disappointment. "She lived here as a girl," answered Sarah, looking for the keys in her bag. "Then the house was abandoned. No one wanted to take care of it." Lucy touched the wall with caution, as if she feared it would crumble. "It is sad," said the girl. "The house is sad." Sarah opened the front door. The hinges squeaked with a groan of decades. Inside, the air smelled of humidity, of old wood, of frozen time. The hydraulic tile floor was covered in dust, but you could still see the geometric designs in blue and white. The walls kept remains of wallpaper with flower motifs. A wooden staircase went up to the 2nd floor with hand-carved railings. Sarah moved slowly, touching the walls, feeling the texture under her fingers. Her engineer mind began to work automatically. She identified structural cracks, humidity problems, beams that needed reinforcement. But she also saw something else. She saw possibilities. She saw a home. "We cannot live here, right, Mum?" asked Matthew, looking at the ceiling stained by water leaks. Sarah knelt in front of her children and looked into their eyes. "Not now," she said softly. "But one day, yes, one day this house will be alive again." It was not an empty promise, it was a plan. During the following weeks, Sarah began to study Grandma Catherine's house with the same meticulousness she used to review projects worth millions. She arrived every afternoon after work, when the sun began to set over the roofs of Brooklyn, and spent 2 hours taking measurements, making drawings, calculating structural loads. Matthew and Lucy accompanied her. They did homework in what had been the old dining room, under a chandelier covered in spider webs. Sometimes they explored the rooms on the 2nd floor, discovering secret corners, built-in closets, a small library with books swollen by humidity. Sarah discovered something extraordinary during the third visit. The mansion had a twin structure. Right next to it, separated only by a party wall, was another identical construction. Same era, same style, probably the same builder. But that other mansion was roped off, with metal fences at the entrance and signs that warned private property, project in development, Anderson Construction. A chill ran down her back when she read the name. Sarah peeked through a slit between the fences. She could see the inside of the site. Stopped machinery, bags of cement covered with tarps, metal structures half installed. Everything looked like a work stopped abruptly. That night, on the subway back home, Sarah could not help but think about it. She knew James Anderson had problems with an important project. She had heard him shouting on the phone in the lobby. She had seen him arguing with men in suits who came down from the 15th floor with worried faces. But it was not her business. She was only the woman who cleaned the floors, the invisible woman. However, that night, she could not sleep. In her mind, the calculations, the structures, the problems that could be stopping a work in a 19th century building were spinning. She knew those problems. She had solved them before, in another life. Finally, at 3 in the morning, she turned on her bedside lamp and began to draw. James Anderson had not had a quiet week in 3 months. The Brooklyn project had become his personal nightmare. 3 prestigious architects had failed to find a solution that would allow the mansion to be restored without destroying its historic elements. The investors were on the edge of withdrawing funding. His reputation, built over 20 years of relentless work, hung by a thread. It was Friday afternoon, and the rain had returned to New York with renewed fury. James drove his BMW through the narrow streets of Brooklyn, on his way to check the site once more, as if staring at it could make the solution he sought appear. It was then that he saw her. Sarah Miller was walking down Aurora Street with her 2 children, carrying backpacks, a measuring tape hanging from her wrist, and a bucket of tools that looked too heavy for her thin arms. The 3 of them went into the abandoned mansion right next to his project. James braked suddenly, not caring about the car behind him that honked with irritation. He watched the scene with a frown. What was the cleaning woman doing entering that ruined building with her children? Did they live there? Was it possible that someone inhabited that structure that seemed about to collapse? During the following days, the pattern repeated. Sarah arrived every afternoon around 6, always with Matthew and Lucy, always carrying tools, materials, buckets. James began to watch from his car, with a curiosity he could not explain. He saw lights turn on in the windows of the first floor, heard the echo of hammers, the sound of wood being cut. The following Friday, he could no longer contain himself. He rang the doorbell of the mansion. It did not work. He knocked on the door with his knuckles. Sarah opened, and James almost did not recognize her. Her hair was loose, covered in white lime dust. Her clothes, old jeans and a stained work shirt, were splashed with paint. She had a plaster mark on her cheek, but there was something different in her look, a clarity, a presence he had never seen in the building on Broadway. "Mr. Anderson?" Sarah asked, surprised. "Has something happened at the office?" James felt strangely uncomfortable. "No, I was passing by and saw that. Do you live in this place?" Sarah hesitated for a moment. Then she nodded. "It is my house. I inherited it from my grandmother. I am restoring it little by little." "By yourself, with help from my children?" James looked over Sarah's shoulder into the interior. What he saw left him speechless. The lobby had been completely transformed. The hydraulic tile floor shone, restored with artisanal patience. The walls had been plastered and painted a warm white. But what really caught his attention were the ceiling beams. They had been reinforced with technical precision, using metal connectors installed exactly at the points of greatest structural stress. "Who did this work?" he asked, pointing to the beams. Sarah wiped her hands on her pants. "I did." "You? How?" She looked at him with those quiet eyes that now seemed to hold oceans of hidden knowledge. I was a civil engineer." The words fell between them like stones in still water. James stared at her, trying to reconcile the image of the woman who cleaned floors with this impossible revelation. "Engineer," he repeated, as if the word were foreign. "I graduated 17 years ago in Boston. I worked in infrastructure until—" Her voice trailed off for a moment. "Until things changed." James entered without asking permission, moved by an impulse he did not fully understand. He walked through the lobby, examining every detail with a professional eye. The plumbing installation was impeccable, following the original pipes but with modern materials. The structural reinforcements showed a deep understanding of load distribution in historic buildings. On an improvised table, made with wooden boards and sawhorses, there were dozens of technical drawings, plans, structural calculations, load diagrams, and something else, detailed sketches of the twin mansion next door. His mansion, the project that was destroying him. "Have you studied my building?" he asked, taking one of the plans. Sarah approached, drying her hands on a rag. "They are twins, same era, same builder, probably the same master mason. To study one is to study the other." James spread the plan on the table. It was his project, drawn with a precision that would have impressed any professional architect. But there were notes in the margins, observations written with clear and small handwriting. "3 specialists have been trying to save that structure for months," James said, with a tone between frustrated and fascinated. "None have succeeded. The project is stopped. The investors want to quit." Sarah took the plan and studied it for several minutes in silence. Matthew and Lucy appeared at that moment, with curious faces at seeing the man from the building in their house. Sarah made a reassuring gesture, and they withdrew discreetly. "The problem is here," she said finally, pointing to a specific point on the plan. "Everyone has ignored the original drainage system." James leaned over the paper. "Drainage? There is no drainage in the historic plans." "Because it is hidden," Sarah explained, taking a pencil. "Buildings from this era had underground galleries to handle rainwater. Look, the natural slope of the ground in Brooklyn goes from east to west. The original builder would have installed a system here, under the eastern wing of the house." James watched the point she pointed to. "There is nothing documented about that in the city archives. There wouldn't be. These galleries were built as part of the foundation, without separate plans. But I can prove it to you." Sarah walked to an improvised shelf and took out a notebook full of notes. "I have been studying the humidity patterns in my house. The stains on the walls are not random. They follow a specific line that indicates where the pipe would be. And I bet your building has the same problem. The gallery collapsed, the groundwater does not drain correctly, and all the pressure is destabilizing the foundations." James felt something light up in his mind. Sarah's words fit perfectly with the symptoms they had been observing. Cracks that appeared always in the same sector, irregular sinking in the floor, persistent humidity that no superficial treatment could eliminate. "If you're right, if there really is a collapsed gallery, how would you solve it?" Sarah leaned over the plan again, and this time took a red pencil. "First, you would have to confirm the exact location with ground radar. Then, instead of trying to repair the old gallery, I would build a new perimeter drainage system that diverts the water before it reaches the structure. Here and here." She marked 2 lines with precision. "This would reduce the hydrostatic pressure on the foundations and stabilize the whole building without needing to demolish anything." James was looking at her as if seeing her for the first time, and in a way, he was. "Why didn't you tell me this before? Why are you cleaning floors if you can do this?" The question hung in the air. Sarah left the pencil on the table and looked him directly in the eyes. There was no reproach in her look, only a simple and devastating truth. "Because no one hires a 42-year-old engineer who has been out of the market for 4 years. Because when I sent my resume, I never passed the first filter. Because I have 2 children to feed, and I could not afford the luxury of waiting for someone to decide to give me a chance." James felt something strange in his chest, something like shame. "Invisibility has many forms, Mr. Anderson," Sarah continued with a soft voice. "Some are more obvious than others." Outside, the rain had increased. The sound of water hitting the glass filled the silence between them. James picked up the plans from the table. Come to the site on Monday, at 9 in the morning. Sarah blinked. Excuse me. I need you to see the site, to confirm your theory. If you are right, he paused. If you are right, I want you to work on the project. Mr. Anderson, I don't... Not as a cleaning employee, as a technical consultant, as an engineer. Sarah remained silent for long seconds. Matthew and Lucy peeked from the stairs, feeling that something important was happening. I will be there, she said finally. James nodded, turned to leave, but stopped at the door. By the way, that day with the mud in the lobby, The words got stuck in his throat. Sarah looked at him with a small smile that held more understanding than resentment. It is forgotten, Mr. Anderson. But both knew it was not, and that it never would be. Monday dawned with a clear sky, something unusual for New York at that time of year. Sarah woke up at 6 in the morning with a knot in her stomach she had not felt in years. It was the feeling of being on the edge of something important, something that could change everything or destroy the small certainties she had built to survive. She dressed with care. She did not have appropriate professional clothes. She had sold or donated everything years ago. But she found some decent black pants and a white blouse that had been her mother's. She tied her hair in a low bun, put on the only closed shoes that were not worn out, and looked in the mirror. The woman who looked back was someone halfway between who she had been and who she had been forced to be. Matthew and Lucy ate breakfast in silence, aware that something extraordinary was happening. "Are you going to be an engineer again, Mom?" asked Lucy with her big, hopeful eyes. Sarah knelt in front of her and stroked her hair. "I'm just going to help with a project, honey. Do not get your hopes up yet." But even as she said it, she felt something sleeping wake up inside her. She arrived at the Brooklyn site at 8:45. The site was surrounded by metal fences, and a security guard stopped her at the entrance. "Good morning. I am here on behalf of Mr. Anderson." The guard looked her up and down with distrust. "Your name?" "Sarah Miller." The man checked a clipboard, frowned, looked again. "You are not on the list." Sarah felt her stomach flip. Of course she was not on the list. It had been an illusion, a moment of madness. James Anderson had probably regretted it during the weekend, had thought it over, had gone back to seeing her as what she was, the cleaning woman who had dared to give an opinion on matters that did not concern her. "I understand," she said with a voice barely a whisper. "There was a misunderstanding. Sorry for the trouble." She turned to leave when she heard a familiar voice. "Sarah, wait." James Anderson was getting out of his car at that very moment, with a briefcase in one hand and a coffee in the other. He wore a dark grey suit that probably cost more than Sarah's salary for 3 months. "She is with me, Rick," he told the guard. "She is the new consultant for the project." The guard let her pass with a confused expression. Sarah followed James through the site, passing by piles of rubble, metal structures rusted by inactivity, machinery covered with tarps. The mansion was even more impressive up close. 3 floors of grey stone with wrought iron balconies, arched windows, a facade that had been magnificent before abandonment covered it with its patina of forgetting. "The building dates from 1882, James explained as they walked. "It was built by a merchant who made a fortune in the textile trade. For decades, it was one of the most elegant residences in Brooklyn. Then it became a tenement house, then a warehouse. Finally, nothing. We bought it 2 years ago with the idea of turning it into the company headquarters. But since we started the work, he stopped in front of a huge crack that ran down the eastern wall from the foundations to the 2nd floor. The problems have not stopped. Every time we try to reinforce a section, new cracks appear somewhere else. It is as if the building is destroying itself." Sarah approached the crack, ran her fingers along the edge, felt the texture of the crumbled mortar. She knelt, examined the pattern of the fractures on the ground. Then she walked inside, ignoring the danger signs, entering what had been the main lobby. The space was beautiful even in its decay. High ceilings with plaster moldings, a cracked marble floor, remains of a monumental staircase. But the walls showed dark stains of humidity rising from the floor like fingers of shadow. "Can I see the geotechnical studies?" Sarah asked. James took a folder from his briefcase and handed it to her. Sarah opened it right there, standing in the middle of the ruined lobby, and began to read with an absolute concentration that made everything else disappear. Soil studies, foundation analysis, reports from 3 different companies, all concluding that the structure was unrecoverable without partial demolition. All wrong. "I need a ground radar," Sarah said without looking up from the documents, "and access to the original plans of the neighborhood if they exist. The original plans were lost in a fire at the city archive in the 40s. I can get the ground radar, but it will cost $3,000, approximately," Sarah completed. "Less than a day of demolition." James looked at her with a mix of surprise and growing respect. "You will have it by tomorrow." At that moment, 3 men entered the building. They wore expensive suits and expressions of authority. One of them, a tall man about 50 with perfectly combed silver hair, stepped forward. "James, we need to talk. Now." His gaze slid briefly over Sarah and dismissed her as irrelevant. "Not now, Richard. I'm in the middle of something important. This cannot wait. The investors want a definitive answer this week. Either you present a viable solution or they withdraw funding." Richard lowered his voice, but not enough. "And frankly, I think you should accept reality. This building has no salvation." James clenched his jaw. "Give me 1 more week." "For what? To hire a 4th architect to tell us the same thing as the other 3? Richard shook his head. "It is time to cut the losses." Sarah had remained silent, but now she took a step forward. "The building has salvation," she said with a clear and firm voice. The 3 men turned to look at her as if a chair had started talking. "And you are?" asked Richard with a condescending tone. "Sarah Miller, civil engineer. And I can assure you that the problem with this building is not in the structure, but in the collapsed drainage system that no one has bothered to look for." Richard exchanged a look with his colleagues. There was barely contained amusement in his eyes. "Engineer? From where exactly?" James intervened with a tense voice. "Sarah is a consultant for the project, and if she says she has a solution, I listen to her. James, please." Richard laughed openly. "I do not know where you got this lady, but we cannot base multi-million-dollar decisions on the theories of someone we do not even know." Sarah felt the old burning in her chest, the old rage against closed doors and condescending smiles. But this time she did not give up. This time she had something to prove. "The water level in this area of New York is high," she said, looking directly at Richard. 19th-century buildings compensated for it with drainage galleries that channeled water toward the old creek that ran just west of here. Your gallery collapsed, probably in the 60s or 70s when the subway work was done. The groundwater has been pressing against the foundations for decades, eroding the mortar, destabilizing the entire structure. It does not matter how much you reinforce the walls if you do not remove the root cause of the problem. The silence that followed was thick. One of the men accompanying Richard, younger with metal-rimmed glasses, looked at her with renewed interest. "How can you be sure that gallery exists?" "Because I live in the twin house next door," answered Sarah. "And I found mine." The ground radar arrived on Tuesday afternoon, operated by 2 technicians from a specialized company. Sarah guided them personally, telling them exactly where to position the equipment, what depth to scan, what patterns to look for. James watched from a safe distance, with his arms crossed and his jaw tense. Richard and his partners had also come, more out of skepticism than faith, clearly expecting to witness a failure that would give them the final excuse to abandon the project. The ground radar sent electromagnetic waves into the subsoil, and the screens showed the anomalies in real time. During the first hour, they found nothing significant. Only the expected structures, foundations, modern pipes, some buried rubble. Richard looked at his watch ostentatiously. "I think this is a waste of time. I have a meeting at 4. But Sarah did not flinch. She asked the technicians to move 3 meters east, exactly where her calculations indicated the main intersection of the drainage system should be. And then the screen changed. An elongated cavity appeared on the monitor, stretching from the eastern wing of the building toward the west. exactly as Sarah had predicted. It was not a continuous line, but a series of irregular spaces that suggested a partially collapsed pipe, fragmented by decades of pressure and neglect. "There it is," Sarah said in a low voice, pointing to the screen. "The main gallery." One of the technicians adjusted the parameters of the equipment. "She is right. It is an artificial structure, definitely man-made, approximately 1 meter in diameter, 2.5 meters deep, and it is completely collapsed in several points." The silence that followed was electric. James approached the screen, studying the images with trained eyes. The data left no room for doubt. Sarah had found exactly what she said she would find. Richard had turned pale. The younger man with metal glasses whistled through his teeth. "This explains everything. The cracks, the persistent humidity, the irregular sinking. Everything." Sarah asked the technicians to scan the entire perimeter of the building. During the next 2 hours, they mapped the entire underground drainage system. A complex network of pipes that had once protected the foundations from water now turned into a network of cavities that was destroying them. "Fine," Richard said finally, with a tone that had lost all its previous arrogance. "You found the problem. Now how do you solve it?" Sarah took a rolled-up plan from her bag, one she had prepared all weekend, and spread it over the hood of one of the construction vehicles. "The original system is unrecoverable. Trying to repair it would be more expensive and risky than building a new one. My proposal is this. We install a modern perimeter drainage system that intercepts the groundwater before it reaches the foundations. Here, here, and here." She pointed to 3 strategic points. "Then we inject expansive resin into the cavities of the old system to stabilize the ground. Once we remove the hydrostatic pressure, the foundations will stabilize naturally." James studied the plan with almost reverent attention. "How long would it take?" 6 weeks for the perimeter drainage, 2 more weeks for the injections. After that, you will need to monitor the structure for at least a month before continuing with the restoration, but the building will be stable." "And the cost?" Sarah had done the calculations with precision. "Approximately $200,000, less than a third of what the partial demolition the other architects recommended would cost." The young man with metal glasses extended his hand towards Sarah. "David Vance, I am a structural engineer, and I have to say your analysis is brilliant, absolutely brilliant." Sarah shook his hand, feeling something she had not experienced in years, professional recognition. Richard remained silent for long minutes, looking at the plan, then the radar screen, then Sarah. Finally, he nodded his head, as if surrendering to irrefutable evidence. "All right. Present the formal proposal to the investors on Thursday. If they approve it, you can proceed." It was not an apology, but it was something like a surrender. When the men left and the technicians began to pack the equipment, James remained alone with Sarah. The sunset light bathed the site in golden tones, softening the rough edges of the ruin. "How did you know?" he asked in a low voice. "How were you so sure?" Sarah looked toward the mansion, toward her own house that rose next door like a mirror of the past. "Because these houses spoke to me," she said simply. "When you know the structure, when you understand how they were built, they tell you their secrets. You just have to be willing to listen." James nodded slowly. "Tomorrow I want you to come to the office. We need to formalize your position on the team. Technical consultant with a contract and appropriate salary. But I still have my work as—" "Not anymore," James interrupted. "From now on you work for me, as an engineer." The words settled over her like a cloak. Sarah felt something break inside her chest, something she had been holding back for 4 long years. "Thank you," she whispered, and in that simple word there was a universe of gratitude, of relief, of silent redemption. The office of Anderson Construction occupied the entire 15th floor of the building on Broadway. Sarah had cleaned those floors dozens of times, had emptied those trash cans, had polished those windows that offered panoramic views of New York. But she had never entered as what she really was. On Wednesday morning she crossed the lobby she had scrubbed so many times on her knees. The security guard, the same one who had seen her 1,000 times in her blue uniform and her cleaning cart, looked at her with confusion when she went directly to the elevator without her work equipment. "Good morning, Mike." She greeted him with a small smile. The man blinked, clearly not knowing how to respond. In the elevator, Sarah looked at herself in the metal mirror of the doors. She wore the same outfit from the day before. She did not have much else. But she had combed her hair with care and found a grey blazer in a thrift store that fit reasonably well. She did not look like a high-level executive, but she did not look invisible either. The doors opened on the 15th floor. The reception was all glass and steel, minimalist and cold. The receptionist, a young woman in an impeccable suit, looked up. "Good morning. Do you have an appointment?" "I am here to see Mr. Anderson. I am Sarah Miller." The receptionist checked her computer, frowned. "I do not see your name on the schedule." "He is expecting me." Before the situation could get more complicated, James appeared from the inner hallway. He had his shirt sleeves rolled up and reading glasses hanging from his pocket. "Sarah, come in, I was waiting for you." He guided her through a maze of cubicles and offices to a conference room with glass walls. Inside there was a long dark wood table, leather chairs and a white board covered with structural diagrams. "Sit down," James said, pointing to one of the chairs. "We need to talk about the practical details." During the next hour, they discussed contract terms, salary, responsibilities. Sarah listened with almost clinical attention, taking notes in a notebook she had brought. The salary James proposed was 3 times what she earned as a cleaning employee. It was not a fortune, but it was dignity. It was recognition. "There is something else," James said, leaning forward. "I need you to understand the situation. Richard and his partners are the main investors in this project. They are men with a lot of money and very little tact. They are going to question every decision, every expense, every delay. And they are going to question you especially. Because I am a woman." "Because you are a woman who appeared out of nowhere," James corrected. "No recent references, no connections in the industry. They are going to look for reasons to discredit you." Sarah looked him in the eyes. "Then we will have to make sure they do not find any." James smiled. It was the first time Sarah had seen him smile genuinely. "That is why I want you to lead the presentation on Thursday. You explain the solution directly to the investors. Your words, your plans, your credibility." Sarah's stomach did a flip. Talking before investors, defending a multi-million-dollar project, putting her reputation, the reputation she was rebuilding from zero, on the line of fire. "Do you trust me to that point?" "I trust that you know what you're talking about," James replied. "The rest does not matter." Sarah spent the next 2 days preparing. She worked at Grandma Catherine's mansion until late at night, refining plans, checking calculations, preparing answers for every possible question. Matthew and Lucy helped her by bringing her coffee, organizing documents, staying silently close while their mother rebuilt her professional life calculation by calculation. Thursday arrived too quickly. The meeting room on the 15th floor was full when Sarah entered. She counted 11 people: James, Richard and his 2 partners, 5 investors she did not know, David Vance, the structural engineer, and a middle-aged woman who turned out to be the project lawyer. All eyes converged on her when she entered. Sarah felt the weight of those looks, the silent scrutiny, the unexpressed doubts. She breathed deeply and walked toward the front of the room where a projector had been set up. "Good morning," she began with a clear voice. "My name is Sarah Miller. I am a civil engineer, and I am here to present the definitive solution for the Brooklyn project." She did not ask for permission to start. She did not apologize for her presence. She simply projected the first image, a plan of the building with the crack locations marked in red. For 6 months, this project has been stopped because 3 different teams incorrectly diagnosed the problem. Everyone assumed the structure of the building was deficient. Everyone was wrong. She projected the next image, the ground radar results. The problem is not in the building, it is under the building. There is a 19th century drainage system, completely collapsed, that is generating hydrostatic pressure against the foundations. Here are the proofs. One of the investors, a heavy man in a pinstripe suit, raised his hand. "How is it possible that 3 teams of experts did not find this?" Sarah looked directly at him. "Because they did not look for it. Historic buildings have secrets that are only revealed when you understand how the original builders thought. They did not leave plans for the drainage systems because they considered them an integral part of the foundations. You have to know where to look. She continued with the presentation, explaining step by step the solution: the perimeter drainage system, the resin injections, the deadlines, the costs. She spoke for 40 minutes without notes, without hesitation, with the security of someone who knows her trade to her bones. When she finished, the silence in the room was absolute. Richard was the first to speak. "It is a solid proposal, but I have a question." He made a deliberate pause. "Where have you been the last 4 years, Sarah?" The question was a trap, and everyone knew it. Sarah could feel the tension in the air, could see James tensing in his chair. "I was raising my children," she replied calmly, "and surviving an economic crisis that destroyed my family. I worked cleaning buildings because it was the only job I could get. But I never stopped being an engineer. I never stopped studying, learning, keeping my mind active. And when the opportunity came to prove what I know, I was ready." There was no shame in her voice, only facts. The woman lawyer leaned forward. "Your academic credentials are in order. I have verified your degree, your certifications. Everything is legitimate. The question is, can you guarantee this solution will work?" Sarah looked her in the eyes. "In engineering, there are no absolute guarantees, but I can tell you this. I have reviewed every inch of that building. I have studied similar constructions from the same era. I have checked my calculations 3 times, and I would bet my professional reputation that this solution will not only work, but it will save the project." One of the younger investors, who had remained silent until then, raised his hand. "How long have you been working at Anderson Construction?" 5 days, Sarah replied without blinking. 3 as a cleaning employee, 2 as a technical consultant. The brutal honesty of the response caused expressions of surprise around the table, but also on some faces, something like respect. James stood up. Sarah found in 2 days what no one else could find in 6 months. And she did it because she has something you cannot buy with money: true knowledge of the trade. I propose that we approve her plan and give her full authority to execute it. Richard exchanged looks with his partners, then he nodded slowly. "All right, but with one condition. I want weekly updates. If something goes wrong, if there is a single sign that this solution is not working, we stop everything immediately." "That is fair," Sarah accepted. The vote was quick. 7 in favor, 3 abstentions, none against. The project was moving forward. When the meeting ended and the room began to empty, David Vance approached Sarah. "That was the most impressive technical presentation I have seen in years," he said with genuine admiration. "If you ever need a professional reference, it would be an honor to give it to you." Sarah felt something warm expanding in her chest. Words she had longed to hear for so long, finally spoken. "Thank you, David. It means a lot." When everyone had left, James remained with her in the empty room. "You did it perfectly," he said simply. Sarah picked up her papers, her plans, the tangible evidence that she was still who she had always been. "It was not perfect," she corrected with a small smile, "but it was real." The work began the following Monday. Sarah arrived at the Brooklyn site at 7 in the morning, before any other member of the team. The heavy machinery was already positioned: 2 excavators, a backhoe, a cement mixer. The operators would start arriving at 8. Sarah walked along the perimeter of the building, checking once more the marks she had traced with orange spray the day before. Each line represented where they should dig, at what depth, with what care. Their calculation error here could further destabilize the structure. Precision was not optional. At 8 sharp, 12 workers gathered at the site. The foreman, a man about 60 named Steve, looked at Sarah with barely hidden skepticism when James introduced her as the engineer in charge. "She is going to direct the excavations?" he asked without bothering to lower his voice. "She designed the entire project," James replied firmly. "Her instructions are followed to the letter. Is that clear?" Steve nodded, but Sarah could see the doubt in his eyes. It was a familiar doubt. She had seen it in 100 different faces throughout her career. She could not fight it with words, only with results. "We will start with the northeast sector," Sarah explained, pointing to the plan she had spread over a folding table. "We dig a trench 1 meter wide, 2.5 meters deep, following this exact line. It is crucial that we do not deviate, because we will be less than 1/2 meter from the original foundations." Steve studied the plan. "That is dangerous. If we touch the foundations—" "We will not touch them," Sarah interrupted. "That is why we will excavate the last 50 centimeters manually. Slow, controlled, with constant supervision." The first hours were tense. Sarah stayed by the excavator, checking every meter of progress, adjusting the direction when necessary. The workers watched her with curiosity mixed with suspicion. A woman on a construction site was not unusual, but a woman giving technical orders with absolute authority over the project was different. By mid-morning, they reached the point where the manual excavation should begin. Sarah put on a helmet, went down into the trench and took a shovel. "Like this," she said, demonstrating the technique. 10-centimeter layers, checking after each one. "We look for any sign of the old gallery." Steve came down next to her, took the shovel from her hands. "With all respect, engineer, this is work for us." But there was something different in his tone now. It was no longer skepticism, it was protection. Sarah nodded and went up, letting the men work. But she stayed on the edge of the trench, watching, noting, calculating. It was Steve who found the first evidence. At 2 meters and 40 centimeters deep, his shovel hit something that was not earth. Old bricks, arranged in an arch. "Here!" he shouted. "We found it!" Sarah went down immediately, her heart beating faster. She knelt next to the exposed bricks, ran her fingers over the eroded surface. It was exactly what she had predicted. The top part of the drainage gallery, partially collapsed but still visible. "Perfect," she whispered. "Now we know exactly where we are." The next 2 weeks were a delicate dance between the old and the modern. They excavated with extreme patience, revealing meter by meter the 19th century drainage system. Some sections were completely destroyed, reduced to piles of pulverized brick. Others remained surprisingly intact, testimonies to the skill of the original builders. Sarah documented everything, photographs, measurements, sketches, not only for technical necessity, but for respect. These anonymous builders from almost 150 years ago had created something extraordinary. They deserved to be remembered. As the work progressed, something began to change at the site. The workers who initially looked at Sarah with doubt now sought her out to consult on decisions. Steve stopped questioning her instructions and began to anticipate them. David Vance came to visit her regularly, marveled by the precision of her predictions. "Everything you said we would find, we found exactly where you said," he commented one day, looking at the perfectly traced trenches. "It is almost eerie." Sarah smiled. "It is not magic, David. It is understanding how the original builders thought. They followed the logic of the ground, of the water, of gravity. If you understand those principles, you can read the ground like someone reads a book." One Friday afternoon, while Sarah was reviewing the last excavated sections, one of the younger workers, a boy about 20 named Paul, approached her timidly. "Engineer Miller, can I ask you a question?" "Of course, Paul. My sister is studying engineering at the university, but she says it is hard that sometimes she feels she does not fit in. I told her about you, how you direct this project. She wants to know—" He hesitated. "She wants to know if she can come one day to meet you." Sarah felt something tighten in her throat. "Tell her to come on Monday. I would love to meet her." That night, while traveling on the subway back home, Sarah reflected on what she was building. Not only a drainage system, not only the salvation of a historic building, she was rebuilding something deeper, the possibility that people could return, that interrupted dreams could continue, that invisibility was not permanent. Matthew and Lucy received her at home with hugs and news from school. They had eaten dinner already. Sarah had left them money to buy something and had done their homework, but they stayed awake, waiting for her, as always. "How is the project going, Mum?" asked Matthew. "It is going well, honey. Very well." "Can we go see it someday?" Sarah looked at them, at her children who had survived years of scarcity without ever complaining, who had understood without anyone explaining to them that things were difficult. "Sunday," I will take you on Sunday. The fourth week of the project brought a complication no one had anticipated. They were excavating the final section of the drainage system when the backhoe discovered something unexpected. A second gallery, deeper and older than the first, built with a completely different technique. Sarah went down immediately to investigate. The bricks of this second structure were larger, rougher, arranged without the lime mortar that characterized 19th century constructions. They looked colonial. "This does not make sense," she whispered, touching the bricks with reverence. "The historic plans do not mention anything before 1880 on this plot." David Vance, who had arrived for the weekly inspection, knelt next to her. "It could be an old aqueduct. New York has remains of Dutch or early structures all under the subsoil. Most were never documented. But if we touch this, if we damage historic heritage, the project will stop indefinitely," David completed. "And we will probably face investigations from the Cultural Heritage Board." Sarah sat on the edge of the trench, her mind working at full speed. They needed to complete the drainage exactly in that area to stabilize the building, but if they damaged a potentially protected structure, the consequences would be devastating. James arrived an hour later, with Richard and his partners following close. The news of the find had already traveled fast. "Explain to me what is going on," James demanded, looking at the exposed gallery. Sarah got up from the trench and spread a quickly drawn plan. "We found an earlier structure, probably from the colonial period. It is partially collapsed, but still shows structural integrity in some sections. The problem is that our planned drainage line goes directly through it here." Richard shook his head. "No, absolutely not. We are not going to let a pile of old bricks stop another 6-month project." "It is not just a pile of old bricks," Sarah replied. "It could be protected heritage. If we damage it—" "Then we document it and move on," Richard interrupted. "No one will know if we do not say anything." The silence that followed was thick as lead. Sarah looked at James, waiting for him to say something to set limits, but James remained in silence, clearly divided between the pressure of the investors and doing what was right. Sarah breathed deeply. "No." Richard turned toward her with an incredulous expression. "Excuse me?" "I said no. We are not going to ignore this. We are going to report it to cultural heritage as the law requires, and we are going to find a solution that saves both the building and this old structure. Who do you think you are to—" "I am the engineer in charge of the project," Sarah replied with a firm voice, "and my responsibility is not only to this building, but to the history of this city. If that means delaying the project a few weeks to do things right, then that is what we will do." Richard turned toward James. "Are you going to let your employee talk to us like that?" James looked at Sarah for long seconds. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the battle between convenience and integrity. Finally, James nodded. "Sarah is right. We report the find." "Then you can forget about our financing," Richard snapped. "We are not going to be trapped in another endless bureaucracy." "If you leave," Sarah said calmly, "we will find other investors, but we will not compromise the integrity of the project." Richard and his partners left furious. When the roar of their cars faded, James turned to Sarah. "Do you realize what you just did?" "Perfectly. You just cost the project maybe $2 million in financing." Sarah took off her helmet and ran her hand through her hair, dirty with dust. "James, if we do this wrong, if we damage historic heritage, we will not only face fines. We will stain your reputation, your company's, and mine. In the long run, we will lose much more than $2 million. We will lose credibility." James remained in silence. "Besides," Sarah continued, "I think I can redesign the drainage to go around the old structure. It will be more complex. It will take 2 additional weeks, but it is doable." David Vance, who had witnessed everything in silence, approached. "I can help with the structural calculations. And I know people at Cultural Heritage. I can speed up the evaluation." James looked at both, then smiled tiredly. "All right. We do things right. Always." The notification to Cultural Heritage was made that same afternoon. David kept his promise. 3 days later, a team of archaeologists arrived at the site to evaluate the find. They confirmed that the gallery was indeed an old brick aqueduct used to channel water from the hills nearby. "It is a significant find," explained the lead archaeologist, a woman about 50 named Carol, "but not necessarily paralyzing. If you can work around the structure without damaging it, there is no legal problem." Sarah already had the new plans ready. She showed how the modern drainage system could curve around the old aqueduct, protecting it while fulfilling its function. Carol studied the drawings with approval. "This is exactly the type of solution we need more often. Engineering that respects the past instead of destroying it." The work resumed with renewed purpose, but the exit of Richard and his partners had left a real financial void. James spent hours on the phone looking for new investors, explaining the situation, defending the decisions they had made. Sarah found him one night at the site, long after everyone had left, sitting on a pile of boards with his head in his hands. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. James looked up. He looked exhausted. "I wonder if we did the right thing. If I should have backed you." Sarah sat next to him. "You did the right thing. And although it seems hard now, in the long run, your reputation will be worth more than Richard's money. And if I don't get new investors, then we will finish the project anyway," Sarah replied with quiet determination. "Slower, with fewer resources. But we will finish it. Because that is what we engineers do, we find solutions." James looked at her with something like wonder. "How is it that you were working cleaning floors? How did we let someone like you stay invisible?" Sarah smiled with sadness. "The world does not see what it does not want to see. But that is changing, little by little." 6 weeks after finding the old aqueduct, the perimeter drainage system was complete. Sarah personally supervised the last connection, checking that every pipe, every valve, every exit point worked according to the design. The final test was done on a Tuesday morning. They pumped thousands of gallons of water through the system while monitoring the pressure sensors installed in the building's foundations. The numbers on the screens were exactly what Sarah had predicted. "It works," said David, looking at the data with reverence. "Perfectly." During the following 2 weeks, they watched the structure with almost obsessive attention. And what Sarah had promised happened. The cracks stopped expanding. The humidity on the walls began to decrease. The building, slowly, was healing. James had secured new investors, people who valued the integrity of the project as much as the results. When he showed them the preliminary data, when they saw how a problem that had stopped the work for months had been solved in weeks, the enthusiasm was immediate. But Sarah knew her true test was still to come. The final presentation was scheduled for a Friday in November. Not only would the new investors be there, but also representatives from the city, the Cultural Heritage Board, and several industry professionals who had heard about the project. Sarah prepared an exhaustive presentation, photographs of before and after, technical data, long-term projections, but she also included something else, the history of the building, of the original builders, of the old aqueduct they had preserved. On the day of the presentation, the room was full. Sarah recognized some faces. Carol, the archaeologist, Mike, the security guard from the building on Broadway, Steve, the foreman, and in the last row, Matthew and Lucy in their best clothes looking at her with pride that did not fit in their small bodies. She spoke for an hour, not only about engineering, but about vision, about how old buildings were not obstacles, but teachers, about how true solutions required patience, respect, humility to learn from the past. When she finished, the silence lasted several seconds. Then, an ovation. Carol stood up. "This project should be a model for all urban restoration in New York. It not only saved a building, it saved part of our history." One of the new investors, an older man with completely white hair, approached Sarah after. "Miss Miller, I have been in this business for 40 years, and I can tell you with certainty that what you have achieved here is extraordinary. If you ever consider working independently, I would be honored to be your first client." Sarah felt something expanding in her chest. Possibilities. Future. That night, James organized a dinner for the whole team at a restaurant in Brooklyn, a few blocks from the project. Workers, engineers, archaeologists, all gathered celebrating not only the technical success, but something deeper, proof that doing things right still mattered. Steve raised his glass. To the engineer who taught us that wisdom has no age or gender. It only requires knowledge and courage. Everyone toasted. Sarah felt tears threatening to come out, but she held them back. This was not a time for tears. It was a time to recognize that she had returned, not as who she had been, but as who she had become, stronger, wiser, unbreakable. The following months passed in a frenzy of activity. With the foundations stabilized, the restoration of the building moved forward quickly. Sarah supervised every phase, but now she had a team that trusted her fully. And while James's building was transformed, Sarah did the same with Grandma Catherine's mansion. With her new salary, she could hire professional help, but she insisted on doing much of the work herself, with Matthew and Lucy by her side. The two twin houses stood side by side, reflecting each other, one becoming a corporate headquarters, the other a home. And in the process, something beautiful emerged, proof that buildings, like people, could be saved. One Saturday afternoon, while Sarah was painting the window frames of her house, James appeared. "I need to talk to you," he said, with an unusual seriousness. Sarah came down from the ladder, wiping her hands on her apron. "Is something wrong?" "I want to offer you a permanent position. Chief Engineer of Anderson Construction. Full salary, benefits, participation in projects, and total autonomy to make technical decisions." Sarah looked at him in silence. "It is a generous offer, James. You have earned it, more than earned it." "But I have another idea," Sarah said slowly. "What would you think of a partnership?" James blinked. "A partnership? You have the contacts, the resources, the infrastructure. I have the technical experience, the vision for complex projects. We could specialize in the restoration of historic buildings, do what we did here, but on a larger scale." James considered the proposal for long minutes. Then he extended his hand. "Anderson and Miller, engineering and restoration." Sarah shook his hand, feeling the weight of the moment. It was not charity. It was not an opportunity given out of pity. It was genuine recognition, earned with sweat and precision and unbreakable truth. "There is one condition," Sarah added. "What?" "Every project we take, no matter how small, we will do right. No shortcuts, no compromising integrity, even if it costs more, even if it takes more time." James smiled. "I would not expect it any other way." The official opening of the restored building was scheduled for a spring afternoon. The city of New York had decided to use the project as an example of best practices in urban conservation. There would be press, authorities, industry professionals. Sarah prepared with care. She wore a new suit, the first she had bought in years, navy blue. Matthew and Lucy accompanied her, no longer as children she had to protect from the world, but as proud witnesses of her transformation. The building was magnificent. The stone facade had been cleaned and restored, revealing details that had been hidden for decades. The wrought iron balconies shone with new black paint. The windows, replaced with modern glass that respected the original design, reflected the New York sky. And in the lobby, where once there were cracks and humidity, there was now a bright space with the original marble floor perfectly restored. On one wall, a commemorative plaque explained the history of the building, of the old aqueduct found and preserved, and of the technical solution that had saved both. Richard appeared during the opening. Sarah had not seen him since that day at the site when he abandoned the project. He looked uncomfortable, out of place. He approached Sarah with an indecipherable expression. "You were right," he said without preamble, "about everything. About the building, about the heritage, about doing things correctly." Sarah nodded without triumph. "I only did my job." "No, you did more than that. You reminded us that some values are not negotiable." He paused. "And I want to apologize. For how I treated you, for how I doubted you. I had prejudices I should not have had." "You are forgiven," Sarah said simply. She did not need the apology for her own peace. She had already found it, but accepting it with grace was part of who she had become. The mayor of New York gave a speech about the importance of preserving urban heritage. James spoke about the technical challenges of the project, and then he called Sarah to the front. "None of this would have been possible without the vision and persistence of engineer Sarah Miller," he said. "She not only saved this building, she saved the idea that we can build the future without destroying the past." Sarah took the microphone, looking at the audience. She saw familiar and unfamiliar faces, but all attentive, all listening. She was no longer invisible. "This project taught me something fundamental," she said, "that a person's value is not determined by the circumstances they go through, but by what they keep alive inside during difficult times. I cleaned these floors, and there is no shame in that. But I never stopped being an engineer, because engineering is not just what we do. It is how we think, how we see the world, how we look for solutions." Her voice was clear and firm. "I thank everyone who made this project possible, but I especially thank those who taught me, during years of silence, that dignity is something no one can take from you. Only you can give it away." The applause was long and sincere. 6 months after the opening of the Anderson construction building, Grandma Catherine's mansion was finally complete. Sarah, Matthew, and Lucy moved in on a fall afternoon when the leaves began to fall over the streets of Brooklyn, and the air had that coolness that promises change. The house was beautiful, not luxurious, but solid, bright, full of details that Sarah had restored with her own hands. The wooden ceiling beams, the hydraulic floor tiles, the wrought iron balconies. Everything shone with the dignity of what is well done, of what is preserved with love. In the second-floor studio, which was once Grandma Catherine's sewing room, Sarah set up her office. A drafting table, computer, shelves full of technical books and rolled-up plans. The office of Anderson and Miller had its main headquarters in the restored building, but this was her personal space, where the best ideas were born in silence. One afternoon, while Sarah worked on the plans for her next project, another historic restoration, this time in Manhattan, she heard the bell. It was James, with a bottle of wine and a smile. "I came to officially see the house." Sarah guided him through the rooms, showing every detail, every technical solution, every design decision. James listened with genuine attention, asking smart questions, admiring the precision of the work. They ended in the back garden, small but carefully designed, with an orange tree that had survived decades of neglect and now bloomed again. "Do you know what is extraordinary about all this?" James said, looking at the two twin mansions from the garden. "That they are one next to the other. My building and your house as a constant reminder." "Reminder of what?" "That sometimes the most valuable people are those we do not see, those who are there doing their work in silence, waiting for the opportunity to show who they really are." Sarah smiled, thinking of all the paths that had led her to this moment. The loss, the humiliation, the years of invisible work, and finally, the opportunity to return. "Do you know what I discovered?" she said. "That I never really left. I was always here, being who I was. I only needed someone to have the courage to look beyond the obvious." James nodded. "And I needed to learn to clean my own mud." They looked at each other in silence, understanding that something had changed between them, not just a professional relationship, but a deep respect forged in truth and mutual humility. Matthew and Lucy came out to the garden, bringing glasses for the wine. The afternoon fell softly over Brooklyn with its cobblestone streets and its 100-year-old stories. Sarah looked at her children, then at the man who once treated her as invisible and now considered her a partner, then at the two mansions that rose side by side as a testimony that redemption is possible. And she understood with crystal clarity that mud marks on the floor do not dirty the one who cleans. They dirty only the one who leaves them without looking back. Invisibility, after all, has many forms, but so does dignity. And in the end, it is always dignity that prevails.